Silence. Shattered. On the morning of April 18, 1942, the unimaginable happened. Explosions ripped through the heart of Tokyo, rocking military targets and civilian neighborhoods alike. For 4 months, the Imperial Japanese Empire had known only triumph, an uninterrupted string of shattering victories that left the Allied powers reeling. But in the spring sky, streaks of smoke traced the path of firebombs, delivered by planes that simply shouldn't have been there. Tokyo was burning, and the fire wasn't the worst of it. The shockwave that followed would be felt across the entire Pacific. The attack was minimal, almost insignificant in purely physical terms. A few factories hit, some fuel depots damaged, less than 50 people killed. By the standard of wartime bombardment, it was a pinprick. Yet this single, audacious raid became the most strategically important bombing mission of the entire Pacific War. It wasn't about the damage done to steel and concrete. It was about the wound inflicted upon the Japanese psyche, the shattering of the illusion of invincibility that Imperial High Command had so carefully constructed. This small fleet of American bombers, flying further than anyone thought possible, had changed everything.
Before this day, Japan's strategy was sound, brutal, and highly effective. Establish an enormous defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles, consolidate gains, and force the financially exhausted Allies into a negotiated peace. The centerpiece of this strategy was the absolute, unquestioned safety of the Japanese home islands. They were the sanctuary, the bedrock from which all conquering power flowed. If the capital was untouchable, the empire was unshakable. But now, that bedrock was cracked, and the Japanese response to this humiliation, this single crack in their perfect armor, would lead directly to the single most decisive, fatal error of the war, the disastrous attempt to capture Midway Atoll. To understand the profound strategic consequence of this small raid, we must first return to the psychological landscape of the early Pacific War, a time when American morale was utterly decimated, and the Japanese Empire stood supreme, believing itself chosen by destiny to dominate Asia. The timeline we follow is one of desperation meeting overconfidence, culminating in a flashpoint where military doctrines collided and the smallest tactical act triggered the largest strategic failure. This is the story of how a handful of brave pilots, flying borrowed machines, forced the Japanese into a desperate, fatal strategic gamble. December 7th, 1941. That date marked the end of an era of American isolation and the beginning of the Imperial Japanese ascendancy. Pearl Harbor was a stunning tactical victory, yes, but its true power was psychological. By paralyzing the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Japan bought itself 6 crucial months to expand virtually unopposed. In rapid succession, the seemingly impregnable strongholds of Singapore and Corregidor fell. The Netherlands East Indies, rich in vital oil, were seized. The Allies were in full, panicked retreat. The sheer scale of the collapse was unprecedented in modern history, validating the most aggressive dreams of the Japanese military planners. The narrative solidified, both internally and externally. Japan was unbeatable. The key architect of this success, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, knew better than anyone the precarious nature of this massive expansion. He was the one who famously warned, after Pearl Harbor, that they had merely awakened a sleeping giant. But even Yamamoto, the cautious strategist, was swept up in the intoxicating atmosphere of victory. The immediate goal was clear: establish the defense perimeter, secure resources, and wait for the Americans to exhaust themselves crossing the vast Pacific expanse. The operational reality dictated that the American response would have to come from the sea, meaning carriers, and those carriers, if they survived the initial onslaught, would have to traverse thousands of miles of ocean, facing reconnaissance patrols and overwhelming Japanese naval superiority long before they reached the core islands. This distance was Tokyo's primary defense, a fortress wall made of water and time.
The Japanese military doctrine held that the capital city, the imperial seat, was entirely safe from air attack originating from the sea. The closest operational American air bases were effectively half a world away, in Hawaii, 3,800 miles distant. This overconfidence was baked into the strategic decisions being made in Tokyo. Why allocate precious fighter squadrons or anti-aircraft defenses to the home islands when those resources were desperately needed to hold newly conquered territory or expand the perimeter further south? Every pilot, every gun, every drop of fuel was being leveraged aggressively elsewhere. The assumption of safety created a vacuum that a desperate enemy was already planning to exploit, not to destroy Japan's war machine, but to obliterate its centralized self-belief. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that winning the war required more than just physical engagement. It required a profound psychological victory. Meanwhile, American morale was plumbing historic lows. The public needed a victory, any victory, a sign that the nation had not been defeated, merely knocked down. Roosevelt knew that a surgical strike against the Japanese capital itself, a symbol of the empire's untouchable might, would achieve maximum impact for minimal military expenditure. It wouldn't shift the tactical balance, but it would fundamentally shift the strategic mindset of both belligerents. The objective was simple: hit Japan where they lived, hit them where they felt safe, and prove to the world that they were vulnerable. The challenge was immense, seemingly impossible. How do you launch bombers from a distance sufficient to evade the vast Japanese reconnaissance screen? Conventional carrier planes simply lacked the range to strike Tokyo and return. The answer lay not in developing new technology, but in applying existing technology in a revolutionary, high-risk manner, using medium bombers built for land operations and somehow launching them from the deck of an aircraft carrier. The man chosen to lead this desperate, almost suicidal endeavor was Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a legendary air racer, aeronautical engineer, and innovator who embodied the kind of audacious thinking required. The chosen weapon was the North American B-25B Mitchell bomber. It had the range and the payload, but it was massive for a carrier deck, requiring a takeoff run far exceeding the length of the USS Hornet's flight deck under normal circumstances. The engineers and pilots embarked on a feverish program of modification, stripping the planes of excess weight, replacing the tail machine guns with dummy wooden sticks to save a few hundred pounds, installing auxiliary fuel tanks everywhere, bomb bays, gun turrets, even storage space. Range was everything. Survival was secondary. The training was brief, brutal, and shrouded in absolute secrecy. Pilots practiced short-field takeoffs obsessively, simulating the rocking, wet deck of a carrier. They were told the mission was critical, that they were heading out far across the Pacific, but they were not told their final destination until they were already underway. The risk assessment was chillingly clear. Even if they successfully launched, there was no safe place for them to land afterward. This was a one-way trip, ending either in a forced landing in neutral China, a crash landing at sea, or worst of all, capture by the Japanese. 16 B-25 bombers, carrying 5 men each, were loaded onto the deck of the USS Hornet, crammed so tightly that their wings overlapped the edges. They were positioned so close together that they couldn't be brought below deck. They had to remain exposed to the elements, visible symbols of the desperate gamble. The Hornet, escorted by a small task force commanded by Vice Admiral William Halsey, set sail on April 2, 1942, embarking on a voyage that naval historians still marvel at for its sheer audacity and operational daring. They were sailing straight into the teeth of the enemy's perceived domain. For nearly 2 weeks, Task Force 16 steamed west, maintaining absolute radio silence, praying the Japanese reconnaissance screen wouldn't find them before they reached the planned launch point, a point meant to provide maximum range to China. Doolittle had planned to launch 400 miles further west than where they ultimately found themselves. That crucial distance was the difference between a high-risk mission and certain disaster. The weather was rough, the planes were drenched in sea spray, and the tension among the crews was unbearable. Every sailor and airman knew the fate of the Pacific theater, perhaps the fate of the war, rested on their ability to remain unseen. Then, on the morning of April 18th, fate intervened. Or rather, a small Japanese patrol boat, the Nito Maru, intervened. At 7:38 a.m., 650 nautical miles from Tokyo, nearly 250 miles short of the ideal launch point, the task force was spotted. The patrol boat was quickly sunk by the USS Nashville, but not before its radio operator managed to send a brief, garbled message back to Japan. Enemy carriers sighted. The element of surprise, the mission's absolute prerequisite, was gone. The enemy knew something was coming, and they knew roughly where it was coming from. Doolittle was immediately faced with an impossible choice: abort the mission and guarantee failure, or launch immediately in worsening weather, hundreds of miles short of their planned takeoff point, guaranteeing that every bomber would run dangerously low on fuel, severely compromising the crew's chances of survival. The risks skyrocketed, but Doolittle knew the value of the psychological blow outweighed the operational dangers. "Launch immediately," he ordered. The clock was ticking not in minutes, but in seconds, before Japanese pursuit planes could arrive. The launch was a spectacle of raw daring. B-25s, already heavy with fuel and ordnance, lumbered down the flight deck, buffeted by waves and crosswinds, their engines screaming for power. Colonel Doolittle, leading the first plane, had the shortest runway distance and the worst visibility. He needed every inch of the deck. As his plane tilted dangerously close to the edge, it finally pulled up, narrowly clearing the bow. One after another, the remaining 15 crews faced the same terrifying moment. Knowing a failed takeoff meant plunging into the freezing Pacific. All 80 men watched in silent awe as the final plane lifted off at 9:20 a.m. The mission had begun, but the hardest part was just starting. A grueling, low-level flight over the open ocean for more than 7 hours, navigating solely by dead reckoning, hoping the minimal Japanese warning hadn't been enough to scramble significant defenses. The pilots flew in absolute silence, conserving every drop of fuel, pushing their heavily modified planes past their design limits. Their target was a nation that had been told, repeatedly, that no enemy could ever reach its sacred soil. They were flying into history, knowing they were almost certainly flying to their deaths or captivity. As the B-25s finally approached the Japanese mainland, flying just above the wave tops to avoid radar, they found confusion. The early warning from the Nito Maru had been taken as an isolated patrol action, not the imminent threat of carrier-borne medium bombers, which Japanese intelligence considered an impossibility. Initial defenses were scattered, slow, and mostly concentrated over the major naval base at Yokosuka, leaving the skies over Tokyo largely unprotected. It was the perfect, terrifying silence before the storm. The moment of impact came around noon. The bombers roared over the cities, so low that the crews could see people on the streets pointing and staring, not yet understanding the gravity of the situation. Some thought they were friendly aircraft, perhaps a training exercise. The shock was absolute. Doolittle's plane struck a power plant and an oil storage facility in central Tokyo. Other targets included military barracks, industrial areas in Yokohama, and fuel dumps in Kobe. Though the military damage was light, the precise aiming at targets in the sacred capital had a profound resonance. The realization dawned slowly across the empire. The Americans had penetrated the inner sanctum. The psychological assault was immediate and effective. The imperial palace, home to the Emperor Hirohito, was only narrowly avoided by a couple of planes, a fact that terrified the imperial court. This was no skirmish. This was a personal insult to the very heart of the Japanese nationhood. The myth of the impenetrable homeland, which had been fundamental to Japan's strategic risk assessment, had vanished in a cloud of smoke and panic. The bombers, having successfully dropped their payloads, now had to face the most dangerous part of the mission, the race for survival. Every crew pushed their B-25s south and west, towards the coastal regions of China controlled by friendly nationalist forces. But the premature launch had robbed them of critical fuel. As night fell, one by one, the planes ran dry. Crews were forced to bail out in darkness, jump into the vast mountainous terrain, or ditch their planes violently into the sea. Only one plane landed safely in Soviet territory, where the crew was interned. The mission was a resounding success for the U.S., but a human tragedy for many of its participants.
Of the 80 airmen, 69 survived, mostly thanks to incredible luck and the assistance of the Chinese populace. However, 8 men were captured by the Of the 80 airmen, 69 survived, mostly thanks to incredible luck and the assistance of the Chinese populace. However, 8 men were captured by the Japanese, subjected to horrendous treatment, tried as war criminals, a violation of the laws of war, and 3 were executed by firing squad. The fate of these captured raiders served as a grim reminder of the mission's severity, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The news hit America like a tidal wave of relief and defiance. A few dozen planes had accomplished what months of resistance could not. They had given the American public tangible hope. But the true, world-changing impact was occurring 4,000 miles away, in the marble halls of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The reaction was not one of minor irritation over property damage. It was explosive fury and profound embarrassment. The attack was proof positive that the current defensive perimeter was inadequate. The most sacred duty of the Imperial Navy, ensuring the safety of the Emperor and the homeland, had been catastrophically breached. There was an immediate, overwhelming demand for strategic retribution and, more importantly, strategic rectification. Admiral Yamamoto, who had previously been cautious about extending the perimeter too far, now found his position strengthened by this sudden, profound panic. He had long believed that the only way to truly secure the gains of the war was to eliminate the remaining American carrier fleet in a single, decisive battle. Prior to the Doolittle raid, the Japanese High Command had been distracted by smaller operations, focusing on supporting the push into the South Pacific or consolidating the Indian Ocean. The raid instantly sharpened their focus, giving Yamamoto the political leverage he needed to push his decisive battle plan to the absolute forefront. The Japanese reasoned that the B-25s must have come from carriers, the only vessels capable of bringing them close enough. Therefore, the priority must be the destruction of those American carriers and the establishment of a defensive screen so far east that future raids would become physical impossibilities. This new expanded defensive boundary required taking a key strategic position in the Central Pacific, Midway Atoll. Capturing Midway would serve 2 crucial functions. It would act as a forward airbase, and, critically, it would force the remaining U.S. carriers out of their protected anchorages to fight, thus fulfilling Yamamoto's primary strategic objective. The Doolittle raid thus accelerated Operation MI, the plan to capture Midway, and fundamentally altered its urgency. It introduced a feverish need for haste and immediate action that would override sound military planning. Yamamoto was given permission to commit virtually the entirety of the combined fleet, including all 4 of his irreplaceable large fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The obsession was the carriers. Everything else, including robust reconnaissance and sensible force concentration, took a back seat to the need for speedy vengeance. This desperate strategic overreach was compounded by a critical error, the splitting of forces. In an effort to hedge their bets and further expand the northern perimeter, Yamamoto insisted on simultaneously executing Operation AL, the invasion of the Aleutian Islands. This diversionary tactic, intended to confuse the Americans, ended up diluting Japan's air power and confusing their own command structure. Cruisers, destroyers, and 2 smaller carriers were pulled north, assets that would prove critically absent just weeks later in the massive showdown near Midway. Japan was fighting 2 major operations when all its power should have been consolidated. Contrast this hurried, emotional Japanese planning with the grim, systematic work being done by the Americans. While the Doolittle raid provided the morale boost, the true operational edge was provided by the cryptographers.
U.S. Navy intelligence, thanks to the mastery of Japanese code JN-25B, had been listening. They knew the targets, they knew the timing, and they knew the scale of the approaching Japanese armada. Where Yamamoto planned a surprise attack, the Americans planned an ambush. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, now knew exactly where and when the enemy would strike. He marshaled his few available carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, freshly returned from the Doolittle mission, and the badly damaged but rapidly repaired USS Yorktown. Nimitz later stood that he was grossly outnumbered in battleships and cruisers, but he possessed the one weapon the Japanese were blindly focused on eliminating, the element of surprise and the ability to strike first with air power. The stage was set for the Battle of Midway, arguably the most important naval battle of the entire war. The key factor that drove the Japanese fleet into this strategic trap was the Doolittle raid. Had the raid never happened, the Japanese timetable would have been slower, their focus perhaps still diffused, and the Americans would have lacked the critical pressure necessary to repair the Yorktown in record time, potentially altering the carrier balance decisively.